So, hi, I'm Sherry Lee Smith. We're here talking to Caroline Burrows about EMDR and neurodiversity affirming practice. So, Caroline, I think most of our EMDR community would know who you are, but would you like to introduce yourself for our audience that might be tuning in from overseas?
Well, I'd like to firstly thank you, Sherry, for having me. It's really lovely to have this conversation. And so I'm based in Melbourne, in Australia, and I am an EMDR trainer and consultant. And my background is in social work and psychotherapy. So I've been practicing in the allied health field for 20 years this year, actually, which is sobering and kind of hard to believe, really. But these days, my two roles are providing EMDR training and consulting, and then I'm also the director of mindful living counselling and psychology, which is a group practice, psychology and counselling practice in Melbourne, where I lead a team of EMDR therapists.
You have a lot going on, don't you?
I do, but it's been really nice actually to really drill it down to two main roles now. And at Mindful Living, my role really is providing vision and oversight and strategic support these days. I actually do much less on the ground day to day than I once did. It's taken 10 years to get to a point where I've got an amazing leadership team that keep the show on the road.
All right. So people that know you know that you're crazy passionate about EMDR, so much so that it's quite infectious. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about your background and why you're so passionate about EMDR.
So I've been working in the trauma field really for most of my career. And when I was working in a sexual assault counselling role, which I did for 7 years, I was, of course, working with victim survivors who'd experienced trauma and was always looking for new ways to be able to support them to overcome the impact of trauma. And I was doing a whole lot of professional development with a lot of the giants in the trauma field. And they kept talking about this EMDR thing. And so I trained in it and really haven't looked back since. And I think for me, the main thing that's really attracted me to EMDR and led me to be so passionate about it is that it feels as though it's really getting below the surface of the tip of an iceberg, I suppose, and really going beyond managing symptoms to help people to truly change the impact that trauma has on their life in a long-term sense and to experience really quite profound and transformative change. And so I think what inspires me about it then is that not only does it lead to those outcomes for clients, which is really, I think, what we're looking for as therapists is things that are going to be helpful. But I think in turn, it really has helped me as a therapist to feel more equipped, to feel more confident to support people in trauma recovery. And then that leads to more inspiration as a therapist. And these days, actually, my role is training and leading teams, but it similarly means that I feel confident and empowered to be able to support the clinicians that I lead to be able to help their clients.
Yeah, and it certainly does get right to the core of issues, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so there's a big push in the psychology community, and I think the wider therapy community
Mhm.
about neurodiversity affirming
Yes.
practice. And so you describe your training as neurodiversity affirming. What does that actually mean in practice? And when we're kind of matching, kind of integrating that into EMDR?
Yes, yeah. Well, I suppose in terms of my training being neurodiverse affirming, I guess what I really try to do is to create learning environments for therapists that enable them to come as they are and to be able to be listening into their own needs as a learner. So, for example, sitting still at a table for 3 days straight in a training workshop doesn't suit everybody. And so, rather than creating environments where people feel that those expectations are put on them, that I openly encourage people to move in the workshops if that's more conducive to what their body needs. Things like providing lots of sensory supports and fidget toys and other items. Also being really considered around providing learning materials in different formats. So everyone learns differently. So providing certain material in written form, others in video form or audio, things like flowcharts and other visual tools as well to support learners. Things like considering the venues that I select for my training workshops. So I've been really considered more recently about ensuring that the venues that I select for my EMDR workshops have sufficient space for people to move about, and ideally to have some space where people can go if they need a sensory break, perhaps somewhere that's a bit quieter or more dimly lit. And ensuring that they're accessible for people with all different bodies as well, and essentially disability or accessible for people who aren't able to climb stairs and the like. And actually that's led me to make some changes to some of the venues that I've selected. So I think it's also just being really open to feedback and to supporting people to learn in whatever way they need to learn, and being accommodating to that as far as I possibly can be.
Yeah, it was just making me think of when you came to
Mm.
Perth and I was helping you out with some training over here, and it
Mm.
really floored me how neurodiversity affirming that was. And
Mm.
that was years ago now. And I think you're
Mm.
probably, um, just stepping into that sort of space at that time. How has that evolved
Mm.
in the years that followed that? Because I'm just really curious as to I
Yeah.
guess how that rolled out over time.
Mm. Well, look, I think in the first instance, it was probably fairly limited to things like providing fidget toys, for example. That's a fairly sort of standard starting point, I guess, in terms of encouraging people to use items to support their focus. But I guess it's been evolving in terms of things like I mentioned a moment ago about considering the accessibility of the venues that I use, but also, I guess, even things like the pacing of the workshops. One of the challenges for being an EMDR trainer is that there's so much content that we cover in these workshops, and trying to find a balance between meeting the requirements of what needs to be covered in the training, but also pacing it in a way that is going to be essentially sustainable for people's energy and their focus throughout the days. So I've started introducing things like movement breaks. So in addition to the formal breaks, at the morning, lunch and afternoon break times, having other movement breaks and inviting people to engage with the material in lots of creative ways. So I've also brought in lots of different ways to help people take away key points from the learning. So things like making use of post-it notes and writing, a key takeaway for each of the 8 phases of EMDR. So one post-it note per 8. So one post-it note per phase. So 8 post-it notes in total, with a takeaway from each of the 8 phases in EMDR, so that they can look at that at a bit of a glance at a later time and have that as a lovely refresher. So just thinking about how everybody learns differently and people have different styles of communication. And I've certainly been trying to level up some of my visual resources as well. So things like when I'm teaching phase 4 desensitization in EMDR, which has just got lots of different steps, which end up being actually quite repetitious once you've done them a lot of times. But for learners, they're pretty intense to start with. And so coming up with some pretty cool flow charts that have taken hours to write, I must say, but have come after lots of requests for those sort of visual tools. And that's, I hope, something that people now really, really appreciate and benefit from.
Yeah, so it's really, I guess, supporting the learning in whatever way suits the individuals that are in there. But I guess like
Mm.
you're seeing patterns of things over time and then implementing that more.
Mm.
You're quite open about your own neurodivergence in the
Mm.
community, and I'm curious as to what sort of influence that has had on how you teach and support other therapists.
Yeah, so I'm a late diagnosed ADHDer, and so I think that firstly that's something that I am feeling really proud of and comfortable to share very openly. And I think that has a lot to do with the shift in our industry in the last probably even only 2 years since I've been diagnosed. I think there's been change. I think if I'd been diagnosed 5 years ago, I would have felt much more tentative, I think, to share that openly. I think there's a lot to be said about the normalizing and the reduction in stigma, even though there's still some way to go. So I think for me, part of it is being able to empathize with the fact that different brain styles need different things, because I've found over many years that I have needed movement breaks myself, or found it difficult to sit for long periods of time, both because of my ADHD brain style, but also things like just back pain and other physical factors. So I think a lot of what I try to create for my trainees and consultees stems really from some of my own personal attunement to some of my needs and the things that I've found to be difficult over previous learning experiences, whether it be workshops or conferences that I've attended. So things like, going to conferences where everybody's really jam-packed in sardines, sitting really close to each other, actually finding that that doesn't support my learning and that my body needs to move, and I prefer to stand up at the back and stretch and sit on the floor at times and the like. So really trying to create that sort of open environment where people can just do that without needing to feel awkward or uncomfortable. I'm certainly learning that having a fidget toy in hand is very, very useful for me in maintaining focus. I actually model that now from the front of the room when I'm training. So I always start my training workshops by actually saying, I'm a proud ADHDer. You'll notice I typically have a fidget in hand or a cup of tea or something in hand while I train, and I invite you to do the same if that's helpful for you. And you would be amazed. It's just so nice to see. There's almost like a bit of a collective sigh of relief in those moments, even if people aren't neurodivergent necessarily, but just that sense of, okay, there's a humanness or a relatability to this, and that if I need to get up and, grab a drink partway through, I don't need to wait until the formal break, or I don't have to ask to use the bathroom or something. I can just do what I need to do, obviously with levels of sensitivity and respectfulness to what's going on in the environment. But I think people then just feel more comfortable to get out their own fidget items. I've had people get out knitting, crochet, sit up the back, stand up, sit on the floor. And as far as I'm concerned, if those things support people's learning, then I'm in full support and agreement with those ideas, because I think that that's going to mean that my objectives as the trainer are being met, actually, which is that people can participate and be themselves.
And I think I also want to say thank you on behalf of our community for you being so open about it. I saw something, I don't know how I came across it the other day, but in our big Facebook group about, and it was almost like someone kind of tentatively putting out there about their own neurodivergence. And I'd reflected on how in the last few years, I think, there's a lot more people that are kind of openly embracing that identity in the community. So thank you for, I guess, standing up and letting everyone know that, because I think that's had a huge shift culturally for our whole community.
Thank you. And I think it's through some of my mentors and other people that I look up to also being transparent and sharing about their own experience, that's given me confidence and courage to do it as well. And on the whole, it's been really well received by people. And like I said, I think that has a lot to do with the way our industry has evolved and the neurodiverse affirming movement. I'm not the developer of any of that. I'm just very much appreciating the opportunity to unmask myself. But I appreciate you saying it.
So we've talked a lot about the training and the EMDR therapist, but I'm curious as to if we do shift gear a little bit towards client-based stuff. What are some of the challenges that neurodivergent clients might face with EMDR?
Well, look, I think firstly, all neurodivergent people are unique, and so there's certainly no hard and fast rules. However, I think that in EMDR, typically, firstly, there can be an over-reliance on visualization in both resourcing activities, things like the calm place activity or resource figures. Often they seem to rely upon or almost expect that people would be able to visualize those resources. And not everybody can visualize. There's something called aphantasia. Some people are unable to generate a clear mental imagery in their mind's eye, as it were, and instead might think in words or concepts. And so I think that's something that certain neurodivergent folk might find difficult. Same goes with even in phase 3 in EMDR, when we ask our clients, when you think of that memory, what's the image that represents the worst part of it? That person may not have an image in their mind. And so there's almost a bit of an assumption, I think, sometimes that people can visualize. So I think that's one area of difficulty for some. I think also for some neurodivergent people, interoceptive awareness. So interoceptive awareness being noticing one's own internal bodily cues and having names or words or language to describe how one's feeling or emotions can be difficult. So something called alexithymia can apply for some neurodivergent people. And I think that can also be tricky in EMDR too, because EMDR relies upon the client being able to report back on what they're noticing over and over and over again, and where they feel it in their body, and to have words to describe what emotions they're feeling and to rate it on certain scales. And so doing that, and particularly doing that quickly, actually, can be difficult. I think some neurodivergent people need a bit more time to process information and may find that it doesn't come naturally to look inward and to give names to describe what they're feeling, or even know what they're feeling and how to put that into words. I
Yeah.
think certainly some of the scales that we use in EMDR, so things like the 0 to 10 SUD rating, subjective unit of distress, and the 1 to 7 validity of cognition rating scale for the positive cognition, I think they can confuse some people, and some neurodivergent folk might find them a bit arbitrary or difficult to quantify. Like, how do I know it's a 4 rather than a 5? What makes a 4? What makes a 5? And I think some neurodivergent folk think in quite concrete or literal terms. And so some of the questions that we ask in EMDR might be a bit abstract, I suppose. And I think just different sensory needs can also be important to keep in mind. And some neurodivergent clients might find that the bilateral stimulation either is overstimulating, so in terms of sensory input, or let's say for an ADHDer who might be a little bit more prone to distractibility, finding that there's not enough taxation of working memory, as we call it in EMDR. So the bilateral stimulation isn't taxing enough. Therefore, their mind is just wandering and getting distracted throughout the process. I think there's some common challenges that can arise.
So there's a lot there in the, I guess, the preparation before we even get to that
Mm,
desensitization phase, but then there's a lot of modifications that are
mm,
needed through that processing as
mm.
well.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think it varies client to client.
Yeah. So I'm curious as to, are there practical ways that EMDR therapists can adapt some of the phases in the protocol to better support neurodivergent clients? I mean, I think you've covered a little bit of it, but is there anything else, any other sort of specific pieces of advice that are, you're giving out again and again in regard to this?
Yeah, look, I think the first thing is to not assume that because somebody is neurodivergent that they will have certain challenges in particular areas. It's about being open to some possibilities and making adjustments only if and when they feel relevant to that individual person. So not assuming that all autistic clients will need a particular modification, for example. They might or they might not. So I think it's really about firstly just working very collaboratively with each client and asking their preferences, perhaps providing some options. And I think really taking the time in phase one, which is the assessment phase in EMDR, to discern with a client what their communication needs are and things like whether they even can visualize. So not making assumptions, taking the time to ask about those things. So if somebody can visualize, then of course we might proceed with things like a resourcing activity with visualization-based instructions. But if a person confirms at that early stage that they're not able to visualize, then we make modifications, which might be that rather than imagining an internal resource figure or a nurturing figure or a calm place, we might use things like YouTube, or we might use music, or looking at something, or smelling something, or listening to something, something externally based to support that person. I think you mentioned before about the preparation in EMDR. Sometimes I think it's about really taking the time in phase two, which is the resourcing preparation phase, to really explain to neurodivergent clients what their role is during the bilateral stimulation when we do come into the reprocessing of particular memories. Because often I think where things get tricky is if somebody's not sure what their job is, what their role is during the eye movements, they'll often get, I think, a bit stressed as to whether they're doing it wrong, or whether they're meant to be holding the memory at the same time as following fingers. So really clarifying expectations. And I think where a lot of people find that it's helpful is to make adjustments when clinically indicated for neurodivergence with the questions that are asked of the client in between sets. So at the end of a set of eye movements in phase 4 EMDR, we ask, what are you noticing now? And for some neurodivergent clients, that question is so vague that they might say, well, what do you mean? I'm noticing that you're asking me a question. What do you mean? What am I noticing? So it might be that for those particular clients, either we've explained more clearly what we mean by that question, or if that's still difficult for them, we might not ask, what are you noticing now at the end of a set? We might just check back in with the target memory every set, because that's a little bit more focused and direct. And even things like when we do ask a client what they're noticing and then they respond and we say, notice that, and then resume the next set of eye movements, I find some neurodivergent clients find even that instruction to notice that can be confusing, because it might mean that they think, well, am I going to notice it and then keep noticing it during the next set of eye movements and almost hold on to it, when actually the intention is just to notice it momentarily and then let whatever happens happen. So for some neurodivergent clients, we might even omit that altogether and just say, so think of the memory. What's it like for you now? Client answers, okay, resume the eye movements. So I think just being a little bit more thoughtful and flexible about some of these instructions, and just being a bit more direct and a bit more specific and literal with the instructions and the questions. I think certainly using visual aids for things like SUD and validity of cognition scales, so pictures or thermometers or other visual measures that people can just point to rather than having to come up with a number in their mind. And I guess also being really considered about the different types of bilateral stimulation that we offer, not assuming that it should be just eye movements, for example. Some people might prefer eye movements with a tactile form of bilateral stimulation, or for some people that might be too overstimulating. So tactile tapping on its own might be more suitable. And I guess the final thing I'd say is I think just pacing the sessions as well. I think one of the other challenges is that in EMDR, we're so used to wanting to just keep the wheels turning and keep the eye movements going that we want the client to be very brief with their reports in between the sets of eye movements. And I teach that as a trainer. We don't want to have 5 minutes of chat in between every set, because we want to keep the eye movements going, because they're going to be what creates momentum and keeps the memory processing. But some neurodivergent people do need a bit more time, need a bit more space to just verbally process what's happening for them. So I think finding a nice balance is important.
Yeah, so I guess there's quite a lot to it, and I think it's really important what you're saying. It really highlights needing to know what neurodiversity affirming practice is in general and how that's going to present in all different ways, to be able to then modify, the standard protocol to make sure that it is neurodiversity affirming.
Absolutely. And with no disrespect intended to Shapiro, I think at the time that EMDR was developed, the thinking and the ideas around neurodivergence were very different back then. And I don't think that being neurodiverse affirming would have been the priority at that point in time, to be perfectly honest. And so I think a lot of the ways that the standard protocol has been developed don't take into account the needs of communication differences and brain style differences. And that's no judgment intended. It's just a sign of the reality of the times. I mean, EMDR was developed over 30 years ago now, and we've learned a lot as an industry since then, and we're still learning.
Yeah, and I think it really is an ongoing journey. So if there are people in the community that would like to find out more about you or about your EMDR training, where can they source that information?
So my website is my name, carolineburrows.com.au. That's the best place to find out about me. And I'm very active on socials as a middle-aged woman, Facebook and Instagram, none of this TikTok and Snapchat business, but certainly I'm very active on socials as well, and people can find my pages via my website. So that's the best place to find out more about me.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Caroline. It's been a pleasure.
It's been lovely. Thanks so much, Sherry Lee.
Thank you.
Thank you.